Okay, welcome to this video introduction to the human rights course. Let's start with the concept of human rights. So the idea is that everybody, no matter if they're old, young, man, woman, rich, poor, no matter where they're born, simply by virtue, by definition of being human, everybody is entitled to certain human rights. And I guess that's something we'd all agree with in principle, but it's something that if we apply that to global politics, it raises some tough questions and some difficult issues, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. I think it's worth remembering that the idea of the individual and individual rights in global politics is quite a new concept. We often talk about the Peace of Westphalia, which was a big peace treaty which happened over 350 years ago in 1648. And this established the notion of state sovereignty, so the idea that within state borders, within the 200 borders of countries around the world, the government in that country is responsible for what happens within those borders. So that was it's a way of looking at the world, a way of organising the world around state borders as opposed to the rights of individuals. And it's only really in the last 50 years that global politics has begun to recognise the rights of individuals. We have talked about rights, natural rights, for a few hundred years. Hobbes and Locke, you know them from the ideology side of the course. They established the notion of individual rights, but only in the last 50, 60 years have human rights played an important role on the world stage. And the key date there is 1948 with the UN's Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that really is signified state sovereignty being replaced as what we call the dominant norm in world politics by individual rights which cross borders. So let's start with talking of different types of human rights. So the key, in fact before that, the key thing with human rights is they are seen as universal and fundamental. So by universal we mean they apply to everybody, and by fundamental we mean they're non-negotiable, they cannot be taken away. Even if you're a prisoner in a foreign country, for example, you're still entitled to the rights that you are owed simply by being human. A thinker called Vassac, a political thinker called Vassac, he wrote about three generations, three types, categories of human rights. The first one is civil and political rights. These are very much rooted in liberalism, and these are rights such as to life, liberty and property. Often they're seen as negative rights. Essentially, these are rights that you have in your private sphere, and it's the idea that no one else can come into that private sphere and take these rights away. Going beyond that private sphere, the second group is economic, social and cultural rights, inspired to some extent by socialism. And this might include the right to education, right to healthcare. And there is a big difference between the first generation rights and these rights, because these rights are positive rights. They require state intervention to enforce. For a right to education, it's not just that people need to stop interfering with me, but someone actually needs to guarantee my access to state education. So these second generation rights are different in nature to the first generation rights, and because of this they're more controversial, and some liberals would reject these second generation rights. Thirdly, Vassac talked about solidarity rights. And these are rights which apply to whole societies rather than individuals, and they might include environmental sustainability, self-determination. Raises questions of whether rights can be applied to whole groups, but these are Vassac's three categories or generations of human rights. So having defined human rights, let's look at different approaches to human rights. Let's start with the realist view. Now, realists don't value human rights very much. They tend to see human rights as peripheral. By peripheral we mean non-central, non-core. Peripheral means on the edge, on the margin. And for realists, they would prioritise security and prosperity. So human rights, take second place to those things. Some realists say that international affairs cannot be viewed in moral terms. That morality and national interest are entirely different things. So realists, they always take a hard-nosed, hard-headed view of the world, and they would see human rights as a nice ideal, but just impractical, unrealistic on the stage of global politics. Essentially, they take issue with human rights on three levels. They would say it's based on a flawed, optimistic view of human nature, based on dignity, respect, rationality. They would take a more pessimistic view. Realists are more concerned with collective behaviour, whole nation behaviour, as opposed to issues concerning individuals. And as we know, I think from the conservative course, we know that realists are more concerned with what is rather than what should be. So less of the kind of idealism about how we want the world to be, and more keen that we recognise the complexity of the world and deal with it as it is, rather than try and change it and change it into a perfect world. Liberals, that was the realist view. Liberal view, obviously, they're far more optimistic, far more positive about human rights. The very notion of human rights is a product of liberalism. And for liberals, civil and political rights are the most fundamental. Many liberals reject economic social rights. That might depend if you're a classic liberal or a modern liberal. Modern liberals are more likely to accept economic and social rights. A couple of critical views of human rights. A recent global justice movement, as we could call it, they see human rights as a basis for fundamental social change, often with an anti-capitalism element to it. And then feminists often focus on women's human rights, so protecting women from degradation and violence. So we've defined human rights, we've looked at different categories and approaches to human rights. Now let's look at protecting human rights. And let's start with that 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Now it was not initially legally binding when it was established in 1948. But in 1966 it did become part of international law, although the UN still lacks power in enforcing these rights, and it does rely on the cooperation of member states. NGOs, non-government organisations, play an important role in protecting human rights. There are now, in 2000 there were 37,000 NGOs, many of whom would claim to have humanitarian motives. We'll use that word again later, humanitarian, but essentially it means based around the needs of humans, and so humanitarian and human rights are very much connected. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International would be two good examples of NGOs very much rooted around human rights, and they use publicity and media coverage to highlight injustice around the world. They try to influence governments and firms, but they cannot force governments or firms to act. So carrying on this look at how human rights are protected, Europe has been at the forefront of human rights protection. In 2009, 48 EU states, or European states, had signed up to the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights. So Europe very much at the forefront of human rights legislation. And now let's begin to look at how human rights fit into this world of states that we have. Let's go back to the problem here. We're trying to say that each one of the 7 billion people in the world has the same rights, or at least the same basic rights, and yet the world is split into 200 different territories, each with their own national law and state sovereignty. So we're trying to reconcile two very sort of distinct and potentially hostile concepts here. And again, the problem is that individual nation states, are really the only actors able to advance human rights, and yet they are often the ones who are seen as doing the abusing. But some states do have a long history of respecting human rights. USA and Europe would be two regions or states that would definitely claim to really prioritise human rights. So why do states claim to support human rights? Well, firstly, let's recognise that nearly all states at least claim to support the 1948 Declaration. It's seen as a precondition for global integration. You won't get too far in the modern world unless you at least claim to respect human rights. But as is often the case, there's a bit of a gulf, a bit of a gap between sort of rhetoric or talk and reality. So we know that some states perhaps talk the talk but don't necessarily enforce human rights in the way that we might want them to. So often, and we'll talk more about Russia and China in a minute, but even countries such as United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, countries which are allied to America and to the West, have often been criticised for human rights abuses. And I guess the reality is that state sovereignty has often triumphed over human rights. So, for example, Russia's treatment of Chechen rebels in the 1990s. The conflict between state sovereignty and human rights is very much an ongoing issue. A quick look at China and human rights. So whenever a Western leader meets up with Chinese leaders, there's always pressure on them to raise the issue of human rights. And certainly there's plenty of examples of political suppression, lack of religious freedom, and issues such as Tibet as well, often cited as examples of Chinese human rights abuses. And I guess this is seen as all the more problematic given China's recent economic sort of resurgence, and it's certainly the case that the economic growth of China has not been matched by political reforms. The war on terror really, I guess, raised the issue of human rights and added a deal of complexity to the issue of human rights as well. So the war on terror, we're looking at America's response to 9/11. And that response has involved numerous human rights violations and controversies. So there have been plenty of civilian deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had the Abu Ghraib issues and Guantanamo as well, the treatment of prisoners of war in Guantanamo. And there's an obvious problem here. If America, the founder of human rights, appears to neglect them, then what hope for other countries? A quick look at human rights in conflict situations. In the mid-1990s in Rwanda in 1994, where there was terrible genocide, and in the Srebrenica massacre in Eastern Europe in 1995, the UN appeared to be powerless in the face of these tragic human rights violations. Srebrenica is the former Yugoslavia. Since the 1990s, there has been increased focus on bringing human rights abusers to justice. So we've seen Milosevic in the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice also plays a key role in this. So that was protecting human rights. Let's now look at challenging human rights. We've got different criticisms here. So firstly, a sort of philosophical criticism of human rights, and there's two strands to this. One is what we might call communitarianism. And they would argue, what the communitarianist argument would be, that there is no such thing as a separate, isolated or atomized self. The self only exists in relation to its community. So this would prioritize group rights and community rights, and perhaps maybe sort of community stability and solidarity at the expense of individual rights. And therefore this would reject universal theories. Remember those two key words, universal and fundamental. The communitarian approach would reject the idea that human rights could be universal, could apply to everybody around the world. A couple of postmodern challenges to human rights. Postmodernism would reject any claim to absolute truth, any claim to universal truth. And they would say that human rights, like all universal theories, should be abandoned or only applied to specific cultures and contexts. A couple of post-colonial critiques of human rights. So post-colonial, the colonial or imperialist period, we're looking at when rich countries like Britain and other European nations ruled parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America. So some post-colonial critiques of human rights. One would be that circumstances vary so widely from society to society, there can be no universal view of human rights. They would simply say that Argentina or other Latin American countries are so different to China or to Rwanda, for example, that we can't possibly talk about universal human rights. Cultural imperialism. So, for example, one example of this is Said's book Orientalism, and he argues that the notion of human rights is quite Eurocentric, and that Europe and the USA would use human rights to try to dominate non-Western states by imposing on them Western cultural values. Asian critique of human rights emphasises Asian values such as social harmony, respect for authority and family. China in particular claims to favour socio-economic reforms over civil and political rights. So they might look at America's talk of human rights and say, well, Yeah, but in America you have a very individualistic society, for better or worse, and they might look at crime figures, they might look at, I don't know, happiness in America and say that individualistic approach doesn't always work, and they would say that in China they respect sort of stability and solidarity more, and therefore they would justify not respecting individual rights to the same extent that America and Europe does. Finally, some Islamic reservations about human rights. Some Islamic critics might argue that all rights can only derive from divine rather than human authority. And they might be concerned about the sort of anti-religious nature of human rights and the individualism which runs through human rights. Let's move on now to a massive subtopic within human rights, and this is humanitarian intervention. So humanitarian intervention is military intervention. It's one country's army invading another country, but primarily to help humans, primarily for humanitarian reasons rather than strategic purposes. So mostly over the years war has been conducted for land or for resources, but in this case we're looking at war, we're looking at military intervention to help humans, to save lives, which obviously is very controversial. So let's look at how humanitarian intervention has arisen. There's 4 reasons why it increased in the 1990s. We saw humanitarian intervention overlapping with national interests to encourage intervention. So with US intervention in Haiti, there was a merge, a convergence, if you like, of American national interests with interests of human rights. I think the 24/7 global media sort of coverage has exposed the dangers of non-intervention. So in Rwanda and Srebrenica, for example, these are more reasons why we saw an increase in humanitarian intervention in the 1990s. Third reason, end of the Cold War meant that the US were the only global superpower, so it was easier for them to influence opinion and gain consensus for intervention. And I think there's also been a growing awareness and faith in human rights. People like Kofi Annan and Tony Blair have, were quite bullish and quite I guess optimistic in terms of the power of intervention to save lives around the world. We mentioned it earlier, but a quick reminder of humanitarian intervention and the war on terror. The war on terror is very much a turning point for humanitarian intervention, because throughout the 1990s there was a general view that there has not been enough humanitarian intervention. We talked about Rwanda, Srebrenica. There was a general view that there should be more of it, and when Britain intervened in Sierra Leone, for example, under Tony Blair's leadership, that was seen as another example of where where humanitarian intervention did seem to save lives. But then post 9/11, since the war on terror, there's been a general view that we've had too much humanitarian intervention. Obviously the Arab Spring has opened up the whole argument again. So what's the link between the war on terror and humanitarian intervention? Well, humanitarian intervention wasn't the primary reason for intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. The US promised to remove oppressive regimes and therefore improve conditions for citizens of Iraq and Afghanistan. So it wasn't a primary reason, but America did claim that it was part of the reason for going into those countries. And yet, despite these claims, due to mission creep and civilian casualties and an uncertain legacy in those countries, I think most people would argue that the intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq had a negative effect on the people of those countries. It didn't help the people within those borders. Some people would argue that humanitarian intervention has morphed into liberal interventionism, part of a sort of neoconservative approach. So market-based economies and liberal democracies acting as if they're better than other systems, trying to impose their systems on other countries. So HI has been tarnished by the war on terror. Most people would agree that humanitarian motives for Iraq and Afghanistan were overshadowed by more powerful, more dominant, more selfish motives from America and from America's allies as well. And it relates to the issue of, can democracy be imposed from above? Maybe Western values are incompatible with the Islamic world, for example. So because of the war on terror, support for humanitarian intervention is now far more difficult to muster, and we've seen non-interventions in Darfur, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Burma, for example. Russia and China consistently oppose intervention, but obviously the Arab Spring has brought this back onto the agenda. We saw what most people would call quite successful intervention in Libya, but now we see Britain and America resisting calls for intervention in Syria. We do need to understand conditions for humanitarian intervention, and we need to understand the practical argument of whether it works or not, but you've got notes on that, so we'll just skip through that for a moment, and we'll look at the question of whether it's ever justified, and we can break this down into obviously a yes and a no argument. So arguments saying yes, humanitarian intervention is justified. We can say that there is a sense of a common humanity, so concerns about welfare cannot be restricted to our own people. We have an obligation to save strangers, and that phrase, save strangers, is quite an important phrase. Second argument for humanitarian intervention, global interdependence, so no state is an island. Insecurity in one country or region could spread to others. It could be argued that HI promotes democracy, and this is a legitimate long-term goal, as human rights abuses are less likely to occur in democratic states. And then from the international community, we could argue that humanitarian intervention strengthens the international community's shared values, and thus contributes to the development of a rule-bound global order. But against humanitarian intervention, we could argue that it breaks international law. We could argue that national interests should be prioritised, that states cannot and should not act outside of their own national interests, and that they are betraying their own people if they save strangers overseas. Very much a realist argument. We could argue double standards. There are so many inconsistencies. Why was there no intervention in Rwanda, Tibet, Chechnya? And we could say that these inconsistencies and double standards really just render the whole concept of humanitarian intervention unsustainable, or kind of irrational. It undermines the whole concept of HI. We could argue that it's based on simplicity. It's too simplistic to go to war to help humans. It's based on a kind of good versus evil worldview. The reality is always more complex than the headlines, hence the problem of mission creep and becoming involved in lengthy wars. Mission creep is when you go to war for one purpose, but then this soon morphs into a different purpose. So America and Britain went into Iraq because of the weapons of mass destruction, but then soon those countries were seeking regime change and other outcomes. So mission creep is when the objectives for warfare change once you enter another country's borders. A final argument against humanitarian intervention is moral pluralism. So we could say that HI involves the West trying to impose its view of right and wrong on others around the world. So it's an arrogant sort of Western concept, and it doesn't respect other cultures around the world. So we started by defining human rights. We looked at different approaches to human rights. We talked about how human rights can be protected. And then we saw some challenges to human rights, and then we looked at this issue of humanitarian intervention and whether this can ever be justified.